Good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is the information session on ecology's development of agency request legislation regarding the Safer Products for Washington program. My name is Kimberly Getz, and I coordinate legislative policy for the Department of Ecology's Hazardous Waste and Toxics Reduction program. And I'm here today, as I said, with Missy and Ember and Stacy, who are helping us out behind the scenes. The purpose of today's discussion is to present our agency request legislation concepts, describe the process, answer your questions, and provide a space for your feedback. As you can see, developing agency request legislation is a lengthy process. Earlier this year, each of Ecology's environmental programs had an opportunity to develop ideas that they wanted to propose for agency request legislation. Those ideas were reviewed and narrowed down by our executive team. And right now, we are collecting information from interested parties, which we will then use to refine our initial ideas. Eventually, we will submit our final proposals to the governor's office and OFM for their review and hopefully their approval. If we do get authorization to proceed, then we will work to find sponsors for next session and proceed with getting the bill filed. If we do not receive approval from the governor's office, we won't proceed, obviously, but it's still possible that a legislator might decide it sounds like a good idea, and they may pick up the idea themselves. If that happens, we treat it just like any other bill. We will not give it any additional assistance or review from Ecology. It would be treated just like any other normal piece of legislation. Now, to provide some background, the Safer Products for Washington program is our main strategy to keep chemicals out of the environment and out of our bodies. It was created by a law passed in 2019, and it set up a 5-year repeating cycle where we identify chemicals and consumer products that may have safer alternatives. Safer Products was intended to be a comprehensive solution to eliminate the need for multiple, one-off bills to address the chemical or product of concern at that exact moment. We strongly believe that this process is preferable to dealing with product restrictions through regulation. This program is very important to the public, and it's one of the ways that Washington residents can provide input about what chemicals and what consumer products that they're concerned about. We consult with interested parties when we choose the chemicals that we're going to focus on, and then again, when we identify which consumer products we're going to review. Safer Products for Washington is also an important part of Ecology's pollution prevention efforts. And preventing pollution is really the healthiest and most cost-effective way to manage toxic chemicals. It's way less expensive to avoid a mess in the first place than it is to clean it up later. So the Safer Products review cycle is broken into 4 phases. The first year is phase 1. What new chemicals are we worried about? This is where we choose new priority chemicals based on scientific research, issues raised in the media, legislative concerns, and community input. The law gives us the option to choose a single chemical, like say 6-PPD, or we can choose a class of chemicals like PFAS. This phase is also where we research potential hazards, adverse health and environmental impacts, and impacts on sensitive populations and sensitive species. At the end of this first year cycle, we are required to prepare a report to the legislature that's due by June 1st, but it's not effective until either March or April of the following year when the legislature adjourns. The second year is phase 2, and that's where we decide what consumer products we are going to focus on. We can either look at consumer products that contain one of the new priority chemicals or class of chemicals, or they can contain priority chemicals from previous review cycles. Once a priority chemical, always a priority chemical. Products are selected based on factors like potential for exposure, volume of sales, and again, community concerns. Ecology has to choose products that are what the statute calls a significant source or use of a priority chemical, but it does not have to be the biggest source. A good example of this would be 6-PPD. Tires are the biggest source of that chemical in our environment, but artificial turf is also a significant source, and we are working on both of those right now. And again, just like with phase 1, we are required to prepare a report at the end of phase 2 that's due by June 1st. But again, it's not effective until the next year's legislature adjourns. Years 3 and 4 is where we spend the biggest chunk of our time. Are restrictions or reporting requirements needed? And for each chemical product combination, we research whether alternatives are safer, whether they're feasible, and whether they're available. If we are not able to prove any one of those elements, then we are not allowed to restrict the chemical product combination. We can require reporting, or we can take no action at that time. A final report to the legislature is due in year 4 of the cycle, again by June 1st, and again is not effective until March or April of the next year. And then finally, year 5 is the final phase of the process. That's rulemaking to adopt new restrictions or reporting requirements. And this is a normal rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedures Act with multiple opportunities for public comment. An economic analysis, including an analysis of impact on small business, is required. If we do adopt restrictions at that time, those restrictions cannot take effect for at least 1 year after they've been adopted. And in phase 4, no report to the legislature is required, but those rules must be adopted by June 1st of the year 5 of the cycle. So we're currently looking for safer alternatives in a variety of consumer products. And as I mentioned, some of those priority chemicals, some of those are containing priority chemicals from previous review cycles, such as alkyl phenol ethoxylates in paint, orthophthalates in sealants, and flame retardants or organohalogen flame retardants in insulation. But the mix of products that you see here on this slide is a really good reflection of how we select products for review. Some of them were chosen because we're concerned about exposure, like bathroom deodorizers is a really good example for that one. Some of these products were chosen because there's a large volume of chemicals involved, such as the PFAS products. And some, like the nail products, were chosen specifically because community members expressed concern about those products. But for all the successes of the Safer Products for Washington program, we do have some pretty significant challenges. The 5-year cycle laid out in the statute really does not allow for much flexibility. And in order to meet the deadlines laid out in the law, we sometimes are limited in how much we can take on. We also have issues getting data from manufacturers about what chemicals are in their products and whether alternatives might be feasible for them. such as our work looking for safer chemicals for firefighting equipment. It can be especially challenging to find information about alternatives that we think might be safer. And unless we can demonstrate those alternatives are safer, feasible, and available, we are not allowed to restrict that chemical we're concerned about. And that's a problem when it comes to a number of chemicals, including 6-PPD in tires. So we are considering asking for some of the following elements to be included in an agency request bill. First up, we'd like to make some changes to our current authority to order data from manufacturers. Our team would like to shorten the time that we give companies to respond. Currently, the statute gives manufacturers 6 months to respond. We'd like to shorten that to 90 days. The current timeline is so long that the data that we do receive can be outdated and unhelpful by the time we get it. We'd also like to ask for more authority when companies don't comply with our data orders, such as maybe not allowing them to sell their covered products in Washington state until they do comply with the order. We may also be asking for authority to charge fees for some activities to help offset our costs in doing things like reviewing exemption requests, which takes a lot of staff time away from our core work. States like Oregon also charge a fee for filing their reports into the reporting database when reporting is required. So that may also be something that we might want to look at. Now that the restrictions from the first couple of cycles of safer products have started to take effect, we realized that the law does not explicitly say that we have authority to require prohibited products be recalled if we find them being offered for sale in Washington. And that seems like something we should probably fix. And we also want to propose some technical changes, like changing those reporting due dates to make them closer to the legislative session and extending due dates for rulemaking if the legislature makes changes to our determinations. Ecology has also been asked to develop 2 additional proposals as part of our agency request work. These both would potentially abbreviate the path to restrictions on chemical product combinations. First, we've been asked to develop an option that would allow ecology to restrict chemical product combinations even when we don't know or can't prove that safer alternatives are feasible and available. The purpose behind an option like this would be to help push the market towards developing a safer alternative, like for 6-PPD in tires. We envision that this option would probably have very long implementation dates, like maybe in the 7 to 10 year range, but we definitely want to hear from folks about that. I should note that we have had issues in the past with bans like this before we knew safe alternatives were safer. And that's absolutely something we're keeping in mind. However, I do think it would be a slightly different scenario than what we've experienced in the past with this option, because previously the restrictions were in statute, and in this case, those restrictions would be in rule. So it would be easier to amend if safer alternatives turned out to not be available. Essentially, this option would help us get back to the law's original purpose of avoiding one-off bills. The other option that we've been asked to develop is looking at whether there's a way to restrict a chemical product combination faster than the 5-year process would normally allow. And again, this would get back to the original purpose of safer products, to avoiding one-off bills. The purpose behind a proposal like this would be to help avoid those bills, and especially like the ones we've seen in the last few years. And we envision that an option like this would be for situations when it's really clear there is a problem, we know safer alternatives exist, and as an example, lead in cookware. Having the debates about what the specific limits should be and what products should be covered would be a lot easier and more productive if they could occur over a longer rulemaking period instead of during the rush of ledge session. And now I want to make it clear that for both of these options, we would not actually be proposing the requirements and the criteria involved. Instead, the bill language would be directing the department to develop the option through rulemaking. And again, that allows us to work with advocates and regulated businesses to make sure that we get the necessary input that would be necessary to create programs like this. And although we're still developing these ideas, I sort of envision something similar to how we developed the program's criteria for safer and in-class criteria for safer. But it would be through a little bit more formal approach being in actual rulemaking. And this is absolutely something that we want to hear your input on. So those are our ideas so far. And again, we want to hear your thoughts and feedback. It does not have to be today. You are more than welcome to think about it and get back to us. But if you do have initial reactions or questions, this is a great time to share those. And again, I'll remind you, we are being recorded. So if you don't want to identify yourself on the recording, please submit your comment or question through the chat and ask Amber to not identify you. And with that, let's take a look at our chat.
So we've got one question so far from Amber Carter. As it relates to recall authority, do you envision allowing retailers and manufacturers to phase out existing inventory? If not, will there be funds available to offset these losses to retailers and manufacturers?
That's a great question, Amber. And those, the recall authority that we envision would be for the existing rules that are already part of the WACs. And when we develop those, we incorporate that as far as our effective dates. So it depends on the product being restricted. But yes, usually what we do is either adopt sell-through dates or we push the implementation date out to the future in order to give businesses an opportunity to clear existing stock. So if the law is working as it was intended to work, that should not be a problem for retailers, because by the time the law goes into effect, they've already cleared the restricted products out. Regardless, there would not be funds available given our significant budget shortfalls for that. I see a message from Troy. Do we have a general timeline in mind for the fast track option? No, that is absolutely something we would love to have input on. I'm thinking back to the meeting that I had where this came up, and I would guess that the legislators who asked for this option to be developed probably had like a 1 to 2 year kind of phase in mind. But that is something that, is not locked in and is absolutely something that we would want to address as part of the rulemaking. So suggestions, absolutely appreciated. But again, that would be something that we would address through the rulemaking. It would not be part of the Z draft that we submit to the governor's office asking for approval, seeking their governor's office approval. Next,
Yeah.
Amber,
What are the criteria for high priority contaminants? Are impacts to tribal natural resources considered in prioritization or fast tracking reviews?
so there are a lot of criteria that we look at as high priority contaminants, and those criteria are laid out in statute 70A 350 020, I think, or 030. I don't have it in front of me. I've got the presentation up. But I bet Stacy can look that up real quick for us. And as far as tribal natural resources are concerned, that is not an itemized line in the statute, but it is essentially included. We look to environmental impacts, specifically including species and populations that may be particularly at risk. So not only could that be tribal members, it could be, folks through their employment, anything that makes a particular group of people particularly at risk from a particular chemical is absolutely on the list. So I think those are absolutely things that are considered as part of the statute, and it is 020. Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that. And so you can, and she's posted a link to that in the chat. So if you want, you can take a look at that. As far as fast tracking reviews goes, that would be an interesting question. And I think that would absolutely be something that could be considered as part of the criteria for a fast track restriction. But again, it wouldn't necessarily be part of the language that we submit to the governor's office for approval. It wouldn't go into the statute. It would be criteria that we would develop through rulemaking to be specific. And again, I put the focus on rulemaking so that it is a more lengthy, thoughtful, non-rushed process to get to the best language we can get to, instead of quick, the deadline's coming. Can we all live with this? Great, move forward. That sort of environment that we typically see during ledge session. And let's see, what do we have next?
Yeah, we have another question from Amber Carter. Does ecology intend to clarify the interaction of products that are covered through other areas of law? For example, plastic packaging regulated by EPR?
I'm not sure what you mean by interaction, Amber. Safer products does, generally speaking, stand alone. There is some crossover to a few other statutes, and potentially one of them is the plastic packaging under the EPR program. The EPR program is actually administered by our solid waste program instead of the hazardous waste program. So it's a little, so there is some coordination involved, but the two statutes do operate independently, just like us reviewing safer alternatives to firefighting gear technically operates separately from the firefighting PFAS restrictions in 78, what is it, 400 something. So there's another statute that governs PFAS in firefighting equipment. So the two are in parallel, but they all exist simultaneously. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question. If not, let me know.
Okay, and we have a few more questions in chat, but I also
Mhm.
see Peter Godlewski has his hand up.
Great, Peter, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the information here. Wondering if you can give a little bit more information on the fee structure that you're looking
Mhm.
at, how much you're planning to within the program cover, and if it's going to be expanded over time, and this is just sort of an early start, or if this is the sort of sum total of what you're looking at.
At this point, I think we would do that through rules. And so for the Z draft, we would just be asking for authorization. And as far as the future, I don't know. Those are the two things that have parallels in other states that we can look to and other statutes. Some of you I know were on the webinar earlier this week about hazardous waste, our agency request legislation related to hazardous waste fees. So some things, I mean, theoretically could be adjusted through there, but I don't envision safer products fees being addressed through that other process. So yeah, I think it would depend on what came up during rulemaking. Okay, let's see. What
Troy's
else we got?
question here,
Yeah, go ahead.
which is a follow-up question. Are there examples of circumstances or chemicals in the past that needed to be fast-tracked, either from ecology or legislators, i.e., circumstances where the current law was insufficient?
Yeah, I think the ones that the recent ones that came up were the lead in cookware and lead in cosmetics was also a big one. I think if we look at past laws, the other one that immediately jumps to mind as something that we could have done through something like this would have been BPA in baby bottles. If you remember a few years back, now it's been 10 years now, there was all of a sudden a big push in the media. There's BPA in baby bottles and sports bottles. And the legislature jumped all over that to get something done right away, right now. We got to get these off the market. So I think that would have been an example. Probably the flame retardants in kids' mattresses. That was quite a few years ago now. But those sorts of, hey, we just realized that there's this chemical that we didn't know was in this product. We know this chemical is bad. We know that there's lots of versions of this product that don't have that bad chemical in them. We should restrict it. I mean, I think that's kind of the impetus behind this idea, if I've understood that impetus correctly.
All right, we have a question from Ryan Murphy here. How do you envision restriction without identification of safer, feasible, available alternatives would work?
I think it would work very much like the existing process works, where we go through rulemaking and we adopt hey, this chemical in this product will not be allowed after X date. It would just not have the technical backing behind it and our research demonstrating that those alternatives are safer, feasible, and available. And the rules as they currently exist and the way we've approached rulemaking under Safer Products for Washington is we don't actually put safer alternatives into the rule when we adopt it. That goes into a report. We say, hey, we've found a safer alternative. It's feasible for this application. It's available on the market. And great, we're going to restrict it. At that point, that part of the discussion ends, and then the focus on the restriction starts. And what's going to be restricted? What level is it going to be restricted at? Which products count, which products don't, etc. And that second part, that's what goes into the rules. So I don't think it would look any different. At least I don't envision it looking any different than what the way the current restrictions work, where there is a safer alternative. I think rulemaking makes it a different scenario than what we've experienced in the past, in that if we get out to that effective date or within a few years of the effective date, and manufacturers are saying, look, the safer alternative doesn't work, or there's problems with manufacturing dates, we aren't going to have enough to get the products to the market by X date. This is a repeating rule making that happens at least every 5 years, right? Because of that statute. So at some point, within the 5 years before that effective date, there is by definition going to be a rulemaking available where we can go in and say, oh, okay, we need to tweak this effective date, push it out a year, push it out 2 years, whatever, seems to be the best option. Again, with rulemaking so that people can contribute to the process instead of it just being decided by the legislature with no input.
And Ryan adds to that question, would restriction without a safer alternative lead to regrettable substitutes?
That is always a fear. And that is something that has to be part of the discussion. It is possible, but we hope we can identify safer alternatives and encourage manufacturers to use them. That said, even the current process could, in theory, lead to regrettable substitutes. The statute as it's currently written does not, we don't tell businesses what they have to switch to. We identify safer alternatives that are feasible and available, but there's no requirement that businesses use those safer alternatives. We can look at BPA as a good example. BPA in water bottles. Everything now is labeled BPA free, right? Well, what did they switch to? A lot of them switched to BPS. What is BPS? It's the mirror image of BPA, right? It's not any better, but that's what people moved to, and now they can say it's BPA free. So yes, that's a potential problem. It's a potential problem in the existing scenario as well.
And Lori comments related to that. Right now, the agency can't regulate regrettable substitutes.
Yep, I agree 100%.
And we've got one more question from Ryan. Can you expand a bit more on the lead in cookware example and using SBWA for a longer process of determining levels with industry or major stakeholders?
Sure. So for those on the call who are not familiar, there has been legislation the last few years to restrict the use of lead in cookware, and specifically in aluminum cookware is where the biggest source is. And there have been debates about what level of lead content is appropriate and how you're going to measure how much lead is in something. And whether you should be looking at parts per million in the metal itself or how much lead comes out of the cookware and gets into the food. So that's been an ongoing thing for the last few legislative sessions. We had originally, we are currently in cycle 2 of safer products for Washington, and getting ready, hopefully, to get some draft regulatory determinations out soon for that list of products and chemicals that I showed earlier in the presentation. Originally, there would have been lead in cookware on that list. And because the legislature took action, obviously there was no need for us to take action as well. So it came off the list and we were looking at other chemical product combinations instead. But I think this is where the strength of safer products for Washington really comes out, is that part of what we do in this process is engage very heavily with stakeholders, both environmental stakeholders and the business folks who are the most directly affected. And we've had great success with other products, having businesses help us understand why they use the chemical, what the chemical does in their product, what they need, what business need they are trying to meet by using this chemical. And a lot of times we have had examples with other chemical product combinations where we've talked with, their chemists talk to our chemists, and we figure out what, another way for them to meet their needs. And I think that would have been a really good opportunity with lead in cookware, to be able to sit down for us to be able to talk at length about, okay, here are the grades of aluminum that we use to make our products. When we order those, these are the specifications that we are giving to our metal manufacturing suppliers. And this is what they can guarantee. This is what they can't guarantee. Oh, you want us to be able to guarantee level X? Well, we've never asked our supplier if they can get us to level X. Let's take some time and go work with our manufacturers to see what they can do. Okay, well, if we meet this level that you want, it's going to cost us, we're going to have to change the grade of metal that we use. And that grade of metal costs a little more. So this is going to be the effect that it's going to have on prices for consumers. And actually being able to drill down and talk to folks and get, hopefully, the best answer we can, instead of the best answer we can get during this limited amount of time that's available to us. So I think that's kind of maybe how it could have gone had we had that opportunity. But instead, it got thrown into the legislative arena and addressed there instead. And not all of those conversations were able to be had, especially in the limited time of session.
And we have a hand up, Troy Nichols.
Great. Hi, Troy, go ahead.
Thanks, Kimberly, for your indulgence. I just wanted to follow up quickly on Peter's question about the fees.
Sure.
In the slideshow, it talks about creating the authority for Ecology to charge fees to help support the program. But I thought I heard you say you do have some authority in rulemaking already. You were just looking for authorization. I may have misheard.
No. No, sorry if I said that, I misspoke. No, we do not currently have any authority to charge rules under safer products. And that's what we would be looking for, authority to do rules, to adopt fees through the rulemaking process. So we do not currently have the authority to charge a fee. And so the Z draft would be something like the department is authorized to adopt fees through rulemaking. Maybe it says something else, I don't know, but that would be the general gist of what we would be looking for in the Z draft. And then we would do a full rulemaking and people could say, I think you should charge fees on this. I don't think you should charge fees on that. I think you should charge fees on this other thing, or you shouldn't charge fees at all. And just as a comparison, I think Oregon's is like $50 to do a reporting filing, and our agency standard for what we call cost recovery. So in the hazardous waste world and the cleanup world, we frequently charge businesses for our time. So it's a straight X number of hours. And I believe that's $180 an hour, I think, for non-technical staff, and a little bit higher than that for engineering staff, which I think, would be, or professional staff, I guess, is how we break it out. So that would kind of, I think if we were talking about exemption requests, that might be where we'd start, is just doing a cost recovery for the amount of time that we're spending, as opposed to, hey, here's a flat fee. But that would be something to address during rulemaking. And somebody could say, no, you don't need to do that, just do a flat fee. Okay, we could talk about that. All right, if you want a flat fee, how much should the flat fee be? Let's get suggestions. So I guess what I'm trying to communicate is, we do not have our minds made up about any of the specifics, right? We are still very much in the generalities world, and the specifics, we do not want to land on specifics until we hear from stakeholders and interested parties. We don't want to be just making decisions in a black box. We want to be as open and transparent as possible, and hear other people's good ideas. Great. We see anything else, Amber?
No, there's no more questions in chats.
Okay. Give folks one last opportunity to chime in. And
we do have from Amber, when will a bill draft be available?
Great question, Amber. My suspicion is we will not be authorized to release a draft until after it's been approved by the governor's office. I haven't heard that specifically, but that is my assumption, that we're not able to actually release, here's our proposal, until the governor has said, you are permitted to have a proposal, go forth. So that we are turning our due date, I should say, let me say when I'm going to turn it in. The due date to the governor's office is in early mid-September, I think, like the second week of September. Maybe it's the third week, but I think it's the second week of September is when it's due. And so we would turn it in at that point. And I do not know how long it will take them to review. I don't know how many agency request bills they will entertain. But we will get them available as soon as we are allowed to do so.
And we've got a couple more questions here.
Uh-huh.
Shall fees also cover mitigation and monitoring for priority contaminants where safer alternatives are not yet identified?
Ooh, that's an interesting concept. Maybe that would be something we would put in the pot for discussion. Absolutely. Everything's on the table.
Okay, and did you say you are reviewing the definition of safer?
Oh, no, I did not mean to imply that we were doing that. So no, we are not at this point currently considering changes to our definition of safer or in-class criteria for safer. I was hoping to sort of mirror that process for developing criteria for other things, because we thought that process to develop those criteria worked really well. So they would be a good place for us to start. That process is a good place for us to start to develop other criteria. And it may or may not follow the same path eventually, especially since, if we're talking about fast track restrictions and restrictions when there's no safer alternative demonstrated, I think those both have a higher level of scrutiny, I guess, if I'm going to start using legal words, right? I think both of those deserve more scrutiny. Maybe not strict scrutiny, but more scrutiny. So I think definitely we would need to do those through rule, as opposed to just here's the criteria. It would have to be, here is a rule containing the criteria, just for, transparency and good government reasons, right? And ultimately, that's always a concern for us is, with this program, I think is kind of the ultimate good government sort of approach to this problem. And we want to make sure that we preserve that. And I think that's why this program has been so successful, is that I feel like we've done a pretty good job working with affected stakeholders and making them feel heard and actually hearing them and incorporating their comments and concerns. And, maybe we don't always do what business wants us to do, and we don't always do what the environmental community wants us to do. But I think we land in a good place, making sure we incorporate as much as possible from the whole spectrum of interested parties.
All right, we have another question here from Ryan. Could SBWA change potential limits on past legislation based on industry feasibility and data? Example, lead and cookware.
So that's a very interesting question. The only way we can do that is if the statute tells us we are allowed to do that. So I think both lead in cookware and lead in cosmetics both have elements in the statute that say, here's a limit unless ecology adopts a rule saying otherwise. And most statutes do not contain that. So the BPA in baby bottles, nope, we can't change that. Lead in cosmetics, yes, we can go through a rulemaking to change the allowable levels of lead. So it depends strictly on the underlying statute and what it authorizes us to do. Kind of like federal law. Sometimes we have to do the same thing as the feds. Sometimes the feds say states can do their own thing.
All right, and another question here. Did these changes come out of the Cycle 3 review of alternatives and feasibility, or were these legislative changes decided before this stage? Unsure given the timeline laid out when this started.
That's an interesting question. These are things that have, I think it depends on which element you're talking about. These are things that have come up since day one. Since day one, we've had troubles meeting our due dates for our reports. Since day one, going all the way back to 2019, we've had concerns that one of these years, the legislature is going to change our regulatory determination, and we're going to miss the adoption deadline because of it. So I think it depends on which element you are talking about. Some of them, have been more recent, like the fees. thing has been very recent because we've had to spend time that we sort of didn't plan on reviewing exemption requests. And we suddenly realized how much time it takes. And oh my gosh, we have some pending restrictions coming up. What happens if everybody asks for an exemption? We're not going to have any time to do anything else. And we're going to be spending 100% of our budget just reviewing those. So, isn't it maybe, if that happens, isn't it appropriate that people asking for an exemption maybe cover the expense related to that? Which kind of goes with our other legislative or agency request legislation proposal of, is it time that we start matching expenses that the agency has to engage in to the work and the businesses that create that need? Should those two things have a better connection? And maybe that's something that we should talk about here as well. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but I hope it did.
All right, a question here from Tim Shestek. Are you considering any changes to the regulatory response options that are currently available to the department? For example, increased worker training or workplace PPE requirements to reduce potential exposure from any priority chemicals or products?
That is not something that occurred to me. No, at this point, that's not something we had thought of. But if it's something you think we should put on the table, hey, we're all ears. Like I said, everything should be on the table. If we're going to make the statute, the best it can be, hey, we're absolutely open to additional things if we can make it fit. No promises, but hey, my door is open.
I don't currently have any other questions.
Okay, great. Well, if there is additional information or feedback that you would like to share, please do so. I do have an initial deadline, an internal deadline next week for some bill language. So I'm going to be busy. So if there is something that you would like us to include, please suggest it. Next week is not the end of the road. That's just the first draft that I have to turn into my Gov Relations staff. And things, but again, that'll be super, super drafty, not anywhere close to being ready to share. So yeah, if you have something you would like me to include, hey, suggest it, and I'll run it by folks and see what happens. Like I said, we are turning things in to the governor. Pretty sure it's the second week of September. So that would absolutely be a drop dead date. So if you want something in, get it in like before Labor Day. So this presentation will be posted on YouTube. I am happy to share the slide deck as well if you are interested. I presume that additional information will be made available on our Ledge Priorities page. That's the website you see here. And otherwise, please just reach out to me. I am going to be around. I'm not going on vacation anytime soon, so I should be available to set up a meeting, talk with you on the phone, or get back to you by email. So I want to thank everybody for listening in today. And again, thanks for giving us your feedback. We definitely do really want to include it. So thanks so much. And I think, Missy, that's the end of the presentation, and we can stop the record.